Okay.
Yes. Oh, wow, that's great. How the pictures turn out, right? Good.
Oh, they're really good. Wait, where do I go? Okay. All right, we're good. Okay. Okay, we'll wait just about 5 more minutes to let everybody log on, and then we'll get started.
Hello.
Hi, Chris.
Hey.
We'll be starting in like a minute. Well, we can go ahead and start right now. All right, so we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone to our April meeting. Just to let you know, this presentation and the Q&A will be recorded and live streamed to YouTube. And I'm sorry that you can't see me right now. My computer is dead and I'm using a different computer and we can't get the camera to work. So I apologize for that. I'm Erin Frigo. I'm the president of the Panhandle Archaeological Society, and our speaker tonight will be Margaret Beck, who will be talking to us about red pigment in the Great Plains, a Pawnee case study. For those of you who are joining us virtually, we ask that you please turn off your speakers to minimize interference. And with that, I will give the floor to you, Margaret.
There, I'm unmuted finally. Thank you very much. Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm really happy to be here. Let me go ahead and share my screen. Let's see. Is it coming through okay?
Yes.
Okay, it's sort of weird when I share my screen, I can't see any of you. So I think you'll just have to yell at me if something goes wrong. So anyway, so tonight, obviously my topic is red pigment or red paint. And throughout the world, in general, the color red is often used by different human communities to denote the sacred or the intangible. For example, in India, anthropologist Daniel Miller has described the color red in general as something that denotes the sacred and something that transforms the mundane into the sacred. In Native North America, anthropologist and member of the Pawnee Nation, James Murray, describes red paint and other colors of paint as among the things, in his words, most acceptable to the Pawnee gods. So the color red often hints at this link to the divine. My own questions about red paint in this context are really mundane. I'm simply asking, what is red paint? How would you make it? What materials are suitable? And the answers to those questions vary depending upon time and place, because those things affect what materials are available and easily accessible, either in your own regional geology or within your broader trading networks over longer distances, and their value within particular cultural and technological contexts. So the time and place I'm focusing on most tonight is the late 18th century, early 19th century, and what's now the state of Kansas. So in particular, I'm focusing on red paint at the Kitkahatchee Town site, which is a Pawnee village located along the Republican River in north central Kansas. So Kitkahatchee Town was occupied primarily in the last decades of the 1700s, although there's good evidence for some repeated reoccupation of the site into the first few decades of the 1800s. So I'm trying to learn more about the red paint at the site and better understand what materials were used to make it. And in so doing, hopefully learn something more about the place of the residents there within a broader social and physical landscape. So red paint use obviously have a very, very deep history in the indigenous Great Plains. The earliest and perhaps the most famous example of red paint use appears at the archaeological site of Cooper in Oklahoma, where you see this evidence of paint use in the Paleogene period. And obviously this the significance of red paint continues for thousands and thousands of years. In this particular image, you can see examples of paint storage bags from the Museum of the American Indian, paint bags that are identified as Pawnee. They're called here paint bags, but I suppose technically they should more accurately be labeled pigment bags. So pigment is the colorant. Often you may find it in a dry powdered form, and pigment becomes paint with the addition of a binder. Now, a wide variety of things are suitable for use as binders. Different kinds of animal fat or plant products, cactus juice, a wide variety of things have been used. Now, paint is in really broad use throughout the Great Plains, certainly at the time that settler colonists arrive and begin to describe what they see in terms of daily paint use. So it's an important component of hairstyles and other elements of dress for both men and women across the Great Plains. Particularly in the first few decades of the 18th century, we have illustrations of this from people like George Catlin. at the time period. So in this particular portrait by Catlin from the 1830s, you can see a Pawnee man wearing red paint in a variety of ways, in the hair, in a roach, on the face, and then on the body in places that Catlin described as potentially being wounds or scars that were acquired in honorable combat. Women wore red paint often on a daily basis as well. And this Catlin portrait, this is of a Wichita woman from roughly the same time period, but this woman is wearing a hairstyle that he described as being common across the entire plains, in which the hair is parted down the middle and a streak of what he calls vermilion or red paint is applied to the center of the part. So people used red paint in a variety of ways. And it was also used on a variety of objects in both domestic contexts and in more ceremonial ritual contexts as well. So probably the best research to date for the plains in general on paint use comes from a work by Mabel Morrow in the 1970s entitled Indian Rawhide, where her focus is really on the different kinds of paints that were being applied to leather or hide objects. So this is another example of red paint use. This is a drum curated at the National Museum of the American Indian. And then on items of daily use, like this hide bag, also identified as Pawnee. Red paint is rarely seen in rock art context. That's probably due to a preservation issue. It's preserved in a few rare cases. And this photograph of rock art comes from the fantastic book, Petroglyphs of the Kansas Smoky Hills. And you can see this panel that has been etched into Dakota sandstone in central Kansas. Unfortunately, what you can also see in this image is the disastrous effects of either intentional vandalism or the attempt to steal part of the rock art panel. That's what that big gaping hole is in the bottom of this image. But you can also see preserved on the face of at least one of the images in this panel, one of the figures has his face or their face painted red. So that was an all too brief overview of some contexts in which red pigments and red paints are seen in historic and ethnographic contexts. Now, I'd like to talk a little bit more about different kinds of materials. And so, again, all of this is meant to kind of present a picture of what might have been available to people in the Great Plains in this time period, around the time period of the occupation of Kipkahotki town. So I'll talk first about different potential red pigment materials, things that have been documented in the region. And then I'll turn in more depth to the nature of red paint at Kipkahotki town and talk about some of the analyses and comparisons that attempt to identify which materials are being used to produce it. Now, in this time period, in the late 18th century and early 19th century, all of the written documentation focuses very, very heavily on imported red pigment. And this is an example of this. This is vermilion. Everything in Catlin's descriptions, for example, tends to get labeled vermilion, and this is broadly happening across multiple historic records. So vermilion itself is a commodity. It's something that's coming into the Great Plains and other parts of North America as part of the fur trade and in large quantities. So you can see a view of vermilion here, this photo from the Minnesota Historical Society. So vermilion in its mineral form is cinnabar. It's mercuric sulfide, and it was imported into North America from different sources over time. So initially, the importers were primarily relying on European sources, and then later on, it's coming primarily from Chinese sources. But it's a brilliant red color that was a very popular, apparently, trade item as part of the fur trade. There's enough vermilion at some fur trade sites. One particular site in Minnesota, in fact, that there's so much vermilion stored there that even today you can still see mercury contamination in the soil and water around the trading post. The Museum of the Fur Trade goes into some detail, has some publications and some exhibits related to vermilion use and vermilion trading in the region. In this particular photograph, you can get a nice view of one of the small packets of Chinese origin of vermilion that's moving into some indigenous communities through the fur trade. So vermilion's one possibility for paint use at Kitgahaki Town. There's ample evidence that, that people at the site were engaged in the fur trade. Some of the most abundant faunal remains at the site are in fact beaver bones. And I'll talk a little bit later about analysis of fats in ceramics at Kitgahaki Town, where there is evidence of preserved beaver fat in some bull shirts. So beaver is important and probably something that's being heavily traded. So presumably vermilion's a real possibility for red paint there. Now, another possibility is actually ground pipestone. And this is the only raw material that's been ethnographically described explicitly as pigment material for the Pawnee. Jean Weltfish in The Lost Universe has a throwaway mention about carving pipestone and mentions that pipestone powder is being collected and saved to use as paint. This is something that modern pipestone carvers describe doing as well. And it makes a bright red paint when mixed with animal fat. So again, this is another viable possibility for Pawnee people in this part of the plains in this time period. Pipestone is being actively carved. Pipestone is coming from a couple of different potential sources. In this particular period, most of it's actually coming from the quarries in southwestern Minnesota. So that particular pipestone from southwestern Minnesota is now, that source is now within, at least in large part within the boundaries of Pipestone National Monument. And it's been referred to as Minnesota pipestone or Catlinite, after George Catlin's description of it. And it's being worked, and presumably a lot of powder would be available. So this particular material is unusually soft and carvable. I mean, one reason why pipestone from the Pipestone National Monument area is so heavily prized is that it's especially soft and carvable because unlike other pipestones documented from other regions, this pipestone doesn't have any quartz. So when it's worked, it produces a lot of soft, fine powder. You can also manipulate this powder into a paint with the addition of animal fat or another binder. So here in this particular screen grab of a YouTube video, you can see a carving demonstration in progress. There are people, so the only carvers, the only people allowed to quarry a Pipestone National Monument are Native Americans, and they apply for a permit there. And some of them are also willing to give public demonstrations where they describe the process of carving pipestone. And in this particular video, this carver, Pam, is illustrating the process of working this soft, powdery pipestone. And you can see the pile of pipestone powder on the table in front of her. So again, could have made paint, good paint with this. And then there's this other category of potential pigments, this huge catch-all term, ochre. So in archaeological sites, you find paint stones or globs of red material, and it all gets labeled ochre. And so ochre is a really, really broad category geologically. Scholars who focus on ochre analysis emphasize that ochre is technically any earth pigment, earth material that can leave a red streak or stain in the case of red ochre. And that's enormous, right? I mean, that particular criterion includes lots and lots of different materials, sedimentary, igneous, metamorphic rock, weathered sediments from many of those, iron oxide concretions. So ochre is incredibly broad, which is a bit overwhelming. So now I'm going to turn to a few documented sources of things that have been called ochre. And we'll start with that and then look at some things that are actually available in the Central Plains where, that would have been within easy access, presumably of people at Kitgahaki Town. All right, so one of the most famous ochre sources is the Powers 2 quarry in Wyoming. So this particular source of very high quality ochre in the Northwest Plains is something that has been demonstrated to move long distances. So this is another example of red pigment use thousands of years ago by Paleo-Indian people in the plains, and also a good example of just how portable pigments can be. And there's good evidence of pigments being traded over long distances throughout human history. So this is a good early example of that. I haven't had the chance to go to this ochre source myself. I would love to, but I've been able to see some pictures of it and read the published literature on it. And my impression is, someone is welcome to correct me if they have more information, but I think this is a metamorphic source. I think this particular ochre source is happening within Precambrian schist. You can certainly see just how lustrous this ochre is in this photograph. And also, in case you didn't know, there is a really large community of people on Instagram who enthusiastically share information about natural pigments. And so I borrowed this photograph from one of these people, one of these soil scientists who's on Instagram. All right, so that particular ochre source in the Northwestern Plains is not, it's a good example of the geological variability in ochre sources, but not probably relevant to the ochre that we're finding in north central Kansas. If you go to the other side of the field area, in this case, in the Midwest, in Missouri, you can see another example of an ochre quarry. So this is something that's being documented in the early 20th century when people are exploring various sources of iron ore, iron deposits. And in this particular case, they began iron mining, strip mining, only to find a large network of tunnels and excavations revealing the extent of what may have been hundreds of years of Native American mining in the same location. So iron ore sources are often very good locations of ochre deposits as well, right? I mean, you're looking for this red streaky material. What you can see on the left-hand side of this slide is a tool, a stone tool uses a hammer or a maul that's covered in this bright red ochre from this particular ochre mine. And this deposit shown here is located near modern Leslie, Missouri. So this particular ochre is created by hydrothermal activity. And you can see in this historic photograph a view of the strip mining activity exposing the entrances to these large tunnels through which people in much earlier time periods are collecting ochre. In the Central Plains, if you Google something like ochre in the Central Plains or ochre in Nebraska or in Kansas, you may pull up this photograph from History Nebraska. This is a photograph of ochre in their comparative collection. They've identified it as originating in the Dakota Formation. And in this particular case, they've recovered it, as they note, from stream gravel. So anything showing up in the stream gravel would be the hardest ochre. It has to survive the alluvial transport. And if you look elsewhere in the Dakota Formation, it turns out you can find lots of softer sources of red ochre, which would have been perhaps much more usable for many purposes. So here is a photograph of the Dakota Formation near the Fairbury, Nebraska area in Jefferson County. So this is in the Central Plains, the most likely source of ochre that people are using. This is occurring within sedimentary rock, and you have deposits of either iron oxide nodules or just larger beds of very iron oxide rich clay. And so it's often associated with this very white, friable, fine grained sandstone. Here you can see upslope, if you're looking, the reddish deposit. And here's another view of a deposit a few miles away. It's just, out of this red clayey disintegrating sedimentary deposit, you can see these bright red to purple to yellow iron oxide concretions just weathering out. And it ranges in hardness and appearance, but there's lots of soft, beautiful, bright red ochre. So the Dakota Formation, I'll show you the extent of the Dakota Formation, the Central Plains, and its relationship to the site in a moment. There are other things in the Dakota Formation, the Upper Cretaceous Dakota, that could have been used as ochre, however. Throughout its extent, the Dakota Formation is often mined for brick making because of the variety of colors available within these sedimentary deposits, and the suitability of different shale layers for brick making. So we got permission from the landowners to visit one of these abandoned brick quarries just over the state line in Nebraska. And yeah, you can see here, I've put my daughter to work mining out some of these different layers of shale. But this yellow shale just above her head up here actually fires to a deep red color that's pretty similar to the ochre I just showed you in the previous image. So we know that people around the world for thousands of years have known how to manipulate color using heat. And so there's, for example, in the Upper Paleolithic, we have archaeological examples of people manipulating earth ochre over open fires and near open fires to deepen the color or to shift the color. It's something that happens all over North America as well. And so this is also a possibility, honestly, if you're going by fired color. They could have basically toasted this yellow shale and come up with the same red color. All right, so part of understanding ochre, and specifically in the Central Plains, Dakota Formation ochre, is to put it in broader context, right? How does it compare to other ochres? What does ochre look like in the plains and Midwest in general? And all this comes back to, well, what's distinctive potentially about the Dakota Formation ochre? And so I've been, as part of this bigger project to kind of better understand ochre use and ochre use in the Central Plains, been looking at a variety of ochres from other geological contexts. And so here are a few of the places that I've been able to sample different ochres. And one of the things that I've been doing as part of my comparative collection of ochre is I've also been working with the ochres and preparing them in different ways. And one of these ways has been to make watercolors from them. So part of what I'm trying to document is that these different materials, they differ obviously in geological context and their formation histories, but they also deal in their working properties for related reasons. And so I did this in a very 21st century capitalist way. I mean, I went down to Blick, I bought a binder. In this case, it was gum arabic, and I used it to mix up these watercolors. And then you can see samples of the different colors of some of the ochres in my collection. But things like silt versus clay content, some of these have the color manipulated through firing in my lab and some don't, but they behave somewhat differently. And certainly we can see in archaeological context some variation in the ochres people are using as well. So if you take a look at this map, these are some of the sampling locations. And then in this version, same spots, but what you see in the background is the bedrock geology, the geologic map of the United States. And so again, just a sense of some of this geologic variation. So this blob, this red dot, is Kitgahaki Town, and you can see Dakota Formation exposures in this kind of dark avocado green here. So, and this is also a band, as I've mentioned before, of brick quarry, right? I mean, part of what I've been doing as associated with this project is to travel the Dakota and just visit all different kinds of Dakota exposures, including some of these brick quarries, to just get a sense of the variation of ochre within the Dakota. But yeah, including up into northwestern Iowa, you get quarrying of the Dakota commercially. But there are other contexts in which people can get things that can be used as ochre. Here in southwestern Minnesota, you see the location of Pipestone National Monument and the Minnesota Pipestone source here. Also done some sampling further to the east in the Midwest and the Southern American bottom. And again, the whole idea is to get a much broader sense of, how do different ochres from different geologic contexts differ. But at the moment, I'm all about the Dakota. So let's come back to the archaeological site on which I'm focusing now. And in this map, you can see the locations of well, this isn't by any stretch all of Pawnee territory. This is a small fraction of it, but these are the areas in which you have village concentrations. And so in Nebraska, along the Platte and Loop rivers, you have concentrations of Pawnee villages during the lower Loop phase after 1500. And then after 1750, you have an extension of Pawnee people into some villages along the Republican River in southern Nebraska and northern Kansas. So as I mentioned before, Kitcahawkee Town is across the state line in Republic County, Kansas, on the Republican River. Here you have a blow-up map of the site location. And in this map, you can also just see some documented, this is based on Don Blakesley's work where he's looking at reconstructing different routes of the Pawnee Trail. And one of the offshoots of the trail seems to intentionally lead to the Republican River villages and to Kitcahawkee Town. So this gray blob over here represents Dakota Formation exposures, and you can see it in this inset map here too. Now, this is information taken from the background geology map from the Kansas Geological Survey, and this doesn't mean that the right unit, the ochre-bearing units of the Dakota, are exposed over this entire extent, but it gives you a sense of where people could go. In here, you do have good ochre exposures, and they're not that far east and southeast from the site. So Dakota Formation ochre is one of the three things. Vermilion, pipestone, and Dakota Formation ochre are the three things that I compared with red paint on Kitcahawkee Town ceramics. So here's what that paint looks like at this site. It's primarily recovered on ceramic surfaces. Waldo Wadle talks about finding it in a variety of Pawnee and ancestral Pawnee sites, and he mentions being able to wash it off. So that's not something I have done, but from his written description, I think we can assume that this is material being applied after firing. This seems, in fact, in many cases, to be the contents of these vessels, in particular bowls that are shown here. So I mentioned earlier lipid analysis of some of these ceramics at Kitcahawkee Town. Lipid analysis of only 2 body sherds with paint on them indicated the preservation of mammal fat. And Mary Mullaney, who did the analysis, believed that it was a small mammal fat and very possibly beaver fat. So what this seems to be is red pigment mixed with an animal fat, possibly beaver fat binder to create a paint. So on the left-hand side, you see the sherd I was working with from the site. On the right-hand side, you see a complete bowl from a different site, this one from Nebraska, that just illustrates this vessel form and the pattern of paint on the interior. So we've done a number of different comparisons with the pigment on the ceramics and the comparative materials. So into this comparison, we threw some pipestone samples. Now, Minnesota's pipestone, as I mentioned, can only be legally quarried with a permit by Indigenous people. And so these samples were purchased from people with permits at Pipestone National Monument. So Minnesota pipestone, and then Kansas pipestone, which is a secondary source of pipestone originating from a different place in Minnesota, is in the mix as well. So pipestone and mercuric sulfide is something that we looked for using both laser ablation mass spectrometry and Raman spectroscopy. The idea being that you could recognize mercuric sulfide if it was in there. And then we have the ceramics as well. The interior of the ceramics are shown here. So getting a reading on that thin layer of paint on the ceramics was a bit difficult. It really constrained our choice of methods. What we ended up doing was using, by we, I mean specialists at the University of Missouri Research Reactor actually did this work, right? They analyzed the very, very thin layer of paint on that surface using laser ablation to recover the sample and collect it for chemical analyses. So the comparative materials were analyzed in the same way. And these are the patterns that we found. Basically, we can rule out pipestone entirely as a source of paint material or pigment at the site. There's no evidence of using pipestone. The only pipestone remains, actually that particular Pawnee village, the only thing they seem to have been working, as shown by the debitage, is Kansas pipestone. So it's entirely possible that in other places, Pawnee people did use pipestone. The ground pipestone is pigment, but that, if you had Kansas pipestone and you're working that, the powder may have been too coarse. It might not have been a good pigment. So it's not showing up on any of the ceramics from the site. We can also entirely rule out vermilion as a pigment here. Presumably, people had ready access to it, and yet it's not appearing on any of the bowl interiors from the site. The only possible pigment source that still seems viable is Dakota Formation ochre. So all of the different Dakota ochre samples, including the yellow shale and different samples of iron oxide concretions and more diffuse red clay layers, all of it clusters together chemically, and at least one of these ceramic samples appears in the same chemical cluster. So, we're doing more work to figure out the chemical variation within different Dakota exposures, but there's, promising evidence that this is something worth pursuing. That's probably what people are using. So yeah, just to sum up real quickly, we can rule out vermilion, we can rule out pipestone, ochre, local earth pigments, and probably earth pigments coming from the Dakota Formation are probably what people are using on these bowl interiors, these vessels that are holding paint. And I can only speculate as to why, but I think it's entirely possible that purchased vermilion, this commodity, may not have been meaningful enough for use in certain contexts. It might convey a very different message than pigment that's collected from your own territory. It might have been appropriate for use in different contexts. We also have to consider the possibility that people are exchanging paint over distances. I mean, use of paint from different regions is one way to mark your connections with those places as well. And so potentially there is some paint at the site that's been traded in from other parts, perhaps, of Pawnee territory or from other regions. And so that's something we'll continue to look for as well. And with that, I think I'd prefer to stop sharing my screen so that I can see people and answer any questions that you might have.
All right, well, thank you so much, Margaret. Does anybody, Chris, you have a question?
Yeah, I've got a couple questions. Nice paper. Thanks, Margaret. Good job.
Oh, thanks. Hi, Chris.
Let's see where to start on this whole thing. In Central Texas, there were 3 meteorites that were visited by the Pawnees on an annual basis. They got the skulls. They've got the buffalo skulls surrounding the hilltop, and these almost a ton of meteors in all 3 cases were moved to the top of hills and things like that. And so it's clear the Pawnee came down into Oklahoma, into Texas, to venerate these. Of course, their passion for star charts and things like this, well known and everything. But coupled to this thing is not terribly far from these places. We have a tremendous amount of red ochre beds, particularly in Limestone County. And
Yeah.
These are the ones that were visited by Cabeza de Vaca. Cabeza de Vaca, when he was living on the coast and coming inland to practice medicine among Native Americans in there. So there's opportunities to look a little further afield and perhaps south to consider what you're doing.
I would love to, and I should emphasize that I'm extremely open to any leads that people might have. I went to go visit Sarah Trabert at OU in Norman last month and took the opportunity to do some sampling in the Gypsum Hills in southern Kansas, and then just poke a little bit around Norman. But absolutely, I think going further afield would be tremendously helpful. And depending upon some, potentially big differences in formation context, right, geological context, I feel like probably you could recognize things from other very different contexts. And I think it would be absolutely worth exploring. So I will absolutely, any suggestions you're willing to share, any locations, I am very, very interested.
Basically, the Jewett Mine area
Okay.
around Buffalo, Texas. Those road cuts have red ochre coming out of virtually every road cut that you see for miles and miles around that area.
That's great. Okay.
That might be something to consider. We might be able to. I don't work in that part of the country anymore, but the bottom line is, I bet you might be able to tie into Texans that might be able to collect it for you and send it to you with a locational information. The second thing that came to mind, you mentioned beaver and red.
Yeah.
There's a cave in the plains of Colorado, southeast Colorado, Trinchera Cave. It's been dug by lots and lots and lots of people over the years. There's about 5 or 6 reports on the excavations of Trincheras, because it goes back to paleo stuff and fairly deep deposits. I've only visited that location once in conjunction with local collectors who were tied into the Trinidad Museum at the college in Trinidad, Colorado. And in a crevice, while visiting that site, I pulled out a beaver skull that was painted bright red. And I gave it to the guy that took me there. And I'm almost positive the thing is probably at Trinidad College, Trinidad State University in Trinidad, Colorado. That might be, I don't know if that's of interest to you or not.
Very much.
Sorry,
please go on. Yeah.
I was going to say the other thing I should mention is that, and this is a little far afield, but in the Big Bend of Texas, historically there were, particularly during World War I and World War II, we have cinnabar mines down there. So cinnabar is fairly common to be historically mined in the Trans-Pecos area of Texas. That might be of interest to you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, your mention of the beaver skull brought up something that I'd like to talk about a bit more in the future. I mean, I've been reading a lot of James Murray's work with a lot of interest. And although, I mean, he's really talking about red paint and other kinds of paint as an accessory to other things, right? I mean, rituals and important religious observations. But in the way he's describing the paint, there are often I feel some clues as to the nature of the paint. And one thing I've noticed is this kind of this dualism of the red and the white paint. And I would love to hear other people's thoughts on this, obviously, but because when you visit the Dakota Formation exposures, that sandwiching of this white clay, and the red ochre, it makes me think about the structure of the Dakota appearing in other ways, in the ways people talk about paint and the significance that it has. So I'm speculating there, obviously, but I almost wonder, if you looked at the white paint in more detail, I mean, would you find that it's also coming, from the same context?
One thought that comes to my mind, of course, is the article that Pat O'Brien wrote years ago involving the color of the 4 center posts in the Earth Lodge, or the houses in Kansas, and the color significance on that. And one of the sites I'm playing with is Jack Allen. I've been playing with that for a long time, but all the wood in Jack Allen site is juniper and cottonwood. And of course, the red-white dichotomy in the colors is real obvious in terms of the structure. And Pat's got an article in Plains Anthropologist a few years ago that deals with that, which you might want to do a little further research on. I should also comment that you took the Kansas pipestone material James Gunderson was doing that long before he died, but he was doing a lot of studies between the real Pipestone quarry up in Minnesota and the stuff coming out of Kansas.
Yeah.
I'm aware of some of that literature, but I also should comment that the Permian deposits we're seeing in New Mexico and the Texas Panhandle are also a source of orange to reddish nodules that are being made into pipes.
Oh, they are? Okay.
We have pipe blanks down here in the Southern Plains.
Oh, okay.
Coming out of those pebbles too. I don't know if that would factor into your consideration or not, but I found a pipe blank at Conchas Reservoir, New Mexico, on a survey I did years and years ago. I know that Jim Briscoe has found several pipe blanks in far western Oklahoma too. A lot of those are redstone pipes too, or reddish orange pipes. So, red's very important to everyone. Like you say, I appreciate your paper. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks. Deb Echo Hawk, I see your hand up.
And Margaret, I really appreciate this presentation. It was just beautiful. And Christopher, thank you for all your thoughts as well.
Thanks.
I work for with the Pawnee Seed Preservation Society, and we are building our second Earth Lodge. The first one we built in Kearney, Nebraska, a few years back in 2010, and now we're building one finally in our at our tribal reserve in Pawnee, Oklahoma. So one of the things that I've been kind of pondering is, okay, we're going to build this Earth Lodge, and now how are we going to furnish it? And Christopher, I'm glad you brought up Pat O'Brien, and the mention of the painted poles, because that's something that we were thinking about too. We want to study this out a little bit about what we can do to furnish the demonstration Earth Lodge that we're building at the reserve. So, your thoughts are kind ones, and if you feel like sharing those thoughts, that would be great, because we're just in that process where our nonprofit, of course, is concerned about seeds of our ancestors, and but yet the Earth Lodge was symbolic of with the different color posts. Of course, the posts symbolized lots of things, and plus it also, the colors symbolize the diversity of our seeds. So we feel like in anything we can learn would be just wonderful to reintroduce this to our people. And at this time, the Rikara are helping us build this Earth Lodge, which are people that used to be part of our skeet event in Nebraska. Maybe 400 or 500 years ago. So yeah, I just wanted to say that much and appreciate you, and thank you for bringing up Austin's artwork.
Yeah.
And then we have Jimmy Horn, who has dabbled in using the old time paints that for his parfleche items that are in the Smithsonian, and then of course my uncle Brummett, he was an artist in fine arts, and he loved to dabble with trying to recreate the old paints in some of his images too. But this was fascinating, Margaret. Thank you so much for this presentation. I hope it's shared so that I can I tried to invite my brother Roger, who's one of our tribal historians, and definitely would like Matt Reed to look look at this, who's our, works with historic preservation. So yeah, again, thank you. Appreciate you
No,
a lot.
thank you so much for your kind words. I really appreciate it. And yeah, I'm absolutely very happy to share this. I mean, I believe this will be archived on the Society's YouTube channel. And the work that I'm presenting here, I've also submitted in draft form to Plains Anthropologist. So I'm happy, to share the manuscript. Hopefully it will make it into print. I don't know if there are reviewers in the audience right now, but at some point there may be a published version too. And yeah, I'm very happy to talk about it and learn more from other people about work in this area and things they know. So thank you. Any other questions or comments? I should say, anyone who has anything is also very welcome to email me. I love talking about this stuff. And so, yeah, you can find me on the University of Iowa's department webpage, but please get in touch if there's anything that I can do or if you have any ideas.
All right, well, if there are no more questions, thank you so much for speaking with us, Margaret. And if it's okay, I will probably put your email on the YouTube link.
Yeah, of course. I'd be glad to hear from people. Thank you.
Okay, great.